On a winter evening in Jacksonville, Florida, 23-year-old Bonnie Haim sat in her cozy home with her young son, Aaron Haim, a toddler of just about 3 years old. Her husband, Michael Haim, worked in their family business, and Bonnie balanced motherhood and work with a quiet strength. On the surface, the Haim family looked like the picture of suburban calm in the early 1990s. Bonnie had been born on May 21, 1969. By January 1993, she was still just 23 years old but already a mom, a wife, and someone with plans and hopes. The Haims lived in Jacksonville, and their life was anchored around their child Aaron, their home, and the familiar rhythm of everyday routines. But beneath the facade of normal family life, tension stirred. Friends of Bonnie later reported that she had grown increasingly unhappy and had even taken steps to protect her future, secretly opening a bank account and looking at apartments. In January 1993, when the argument started with Michael that would change everything, Bonnie was at a crossroads. A young mother, a loyal wife, but someone who quietly recognized that things weren't working. At around 7:30 p.m. on January 6, 1993, Bonnie returned home from work. Later that night, she made a phone call to her aunt, upset, tearful, and shaken after a discussion with Michael. It was a moment that would mark the start of a mystery stretching over 2 decades. And so the story begins. A devoted mother, a small child in his home, a marriage under strain, and a disappearance that would leave an entire family in limbo. If you are new here, please like this video, comment your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dive true crime stories. By the early 1990s, the Haims were more than just a family, they were coworkers too. Bonnie Haim worked in the office of the family-related construction supply business, handling accounting, invoices, and financial records. Michael Haim worked as a manager in the same business. On paper, it looked like teamwork. In reality, that shared workspace became one more place where tension simmered just beneath the surface. People close to Bonnie later described a shift, something changing in her tone, her confidence, even the way she carried herself. She had confided to select relatives that arguments at home were becoming more frequent. One of the most alarming stories came from Bonnie's aunt, Even, who claimed Bonnie told her that Michael had once slammed Bonnie's hand in a car door so hard that it broke several of her nails. Whether Michael meant to do it or it happened in the middle of an argument, the message was clear. Things inside that marriage had taken a darker turn. Bonnie had grown careful, quiet, strategic. She didn't just talk about wanting to leave, she began putting real steps in motion. One of the clearest signs that she feared her future was the secret bank account she opened without Michael's knowledge. She began saving money quietly over time, cent by cent, knowing that if she were to leave, she would need financial independence to protect herself and her young son, Aaron. Those who knew her said she was looking at apartments, exploring childcare options, and trying to figure out how to separate herself and her little boy from a marriage that felt more and more like a cage. Bonnie wasn't reckless. She was calculating her escape with the precision of someone who knew her window was shrinking. At home, the arguments continued. Some were overheard. Some were only shared in confidence with family members. But the pattern was unmistakable. The tension between Bonnie Haim and Michael Haim had reached a breaking point. Their home, the place where their son played with toys and watched TV, was becoming the center of growing fear and uncertainty. And as Bonnie continued preparing her exit in secret, the clock was ticking. A decision was looming, one that Bonnie hoped would change her life for the better. But instead, it would mark the beginning of one of Florida's most haunting missing persons cases. January 6, 1993 began like any other day for Bonnie Haim. She finished her shift at the construction supply business, gathered her things, and drove home. She walked through the front door around 7:30 p.m., stepping back into the house where tension had been quietly building for months. Bonnie had told her aunt she planned to stop by later that evening, but that visit would never happen. Around 11:30 p.m., Bonnie made a phone call that would later become one of the most important pieces of the timeline. She phoned her aunt, upset, shaken, clearly distressed after another argument with her husband, Michael Haim. The tone of her voice wasn't new, but it was more urgent than usual. She didn't go into detail, but the frustration and fear were obvious enough that her aunt remembered it vividly years later. It was one more sign that the relationship between Bonnie and Michael had reached a critical point. Inside the Haim home that night, whatever was said between them escalated. Investigators believe that this was the night the marriage finally snapped, the night when all the secret plans, all the pressure, and all the unresolved fights collided. According to Michael Haim's account, the argument continued until around 11:00 p.m. He later told police that Bonnie grabbed her purse, walked out of the house alone, and drove off in her Toyota Camry. He said she left voluntarily. He said he didn't know where she went or why she hadn't returned. Michael also told investigators that he then contacted his mother, Carolyn Haim, asking her to come over to the house and watch young Aaron, who was asleep in his room. Michael claimed he wanted to drive around and look for Bonnie, hoping she had just needed to cool off. But from the start, investigators didn't buy the simplicity of Michael's story. Several key details felt scripted, rehearsed, like a version of events built to explain what was coming next. Detectives noted that Michael showed little emotion about Bonnie leaving so late at night, even though she was a 23-year-old mother who rarely went anywhere at that hour, especially not after such an emotional evening. And there was something else that bothered them. Bonnie never arrived at her aunt's home. She never made another phone call. She never showed up to work the next morning. To detectives, it didn't feel like a woman who had stormed out to clear her head. It felt like a woman who had vanished in the middle of a domestic battlefield, just hours after an emotional call, in a home where tension had been building like a pressure cooker. This was the night everything changed, the night Bonnie Haim disappeared. And for investigators, Michael's story was only the beginning of the questions. By the next morning, January 7, 1993, the first real alarm bell rang. Bonnie Haim did not show up for work. This was completely out of character for Bonnie. She was responsible, punctual, and dedicated, especially because she handled the financial accounts for the business. When she didn't arrive, coworkers immediately sensed something was wrong. Calls were made. No answer. Hours passed. Still nothing. And by midday, concern turned into fear. As police began their investigation, the first major break came from a disturbing discovery miles away from the Haim home. Bonnie's purse was found buried in a dumpster near Jacksonville International Airport. Her ID, bank cards, and belongings were still inside. Nothing was missing. Nothing was stolen. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a mugging. It looked like someone had placed the purse there intentionally, hidden away, not discarded. Then investigators found something even more telling. Bonnie's Toyota Camry was located in an airport parking lot. It was parked neatly, as though someone wanted it to look like Bonnie had left town on a flight. But detectives quickly realized how staged it felt. The purse was in a dumpster, not inside the car. And if Bonnie wanted to disappear, she wouldn't have left everything behind. Inside the Camry, investigators spotted a detail that immediately raised suspicion. The driver's seat was pushed far back. Bonnie was 52, and coworkers said she always sat very close to the steering wheel. But the seat was positioned for someone much taller, someone with Michael Haim's height and build. Even more strange, Bonnie's credit cards and money were still in her purse. Nothing was missing. Police saw no evidence of a random attack. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, and it didn't look like a woman who had run away, either. Detectives took a closer look at Michael's behavior. He told police he thought Bonnie had simply left to be alone after their argument the night before. But investigators didn't see any signs of a woman planning a voluntary escape. She had left behind her son, her job, her money, her clothes. and she hadn't contacted a single family member, not even the aunt she had been crying to just hours before she vanished. With no body, no eyewitnesses, and no signs of life from Bonnie, the case grew more complex. Police felt certain the car was staged. They were convinced Bonnie did not leave that home willingly. But without physical evidence tying anyone to a crime, the investigation hit a wall. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And just like that, the disappearance of Bonnie Haim stalled, frozen in time. An investigation without a body, a crime without a clear crime scene, and a young mother who had seemingly vanished into thin air. For years there were more questions than answers, and the one person who could have shed the most light, Michael Haim, stuck to his story. As detectives searched for answers, one of the most chilling pieces of information came not from an adult witness, but from 3-year-old Aaron Haim. After Bonnie vanished, child welfare officials spoke with Aaron to understand what he might have seen or heard on the night of January 6, 1993. What he said shook investigators. According to official reports, little Aaron told a child welfare worker phrases no toddler should even know, statements like, "Daddy hurt Mommy. Daddy shot Mommy." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. A 3-year-old had no motive, no agenda. He had only memory, however fragmented, and the innocence to speak it out loud. But this created a complicated dilemma. Aaron was just a toddler. His statements could point directly toward violence inside the Haim home, or they could be the confused echoes of a child trying to process fear, arguments, and tension. Some detectives believed his statements were raw truth. Others worried they could be accidental misunderstandings, influenced by the chaos around him. Family members divided immediately. On one side were Bonnie Haim's parents, who were conflicted, confused, and emotionally overwhelmed. In the beginning, they didn't know what to believe. They weren't ready to accept that their daughter might be dead, and the idea that Michael could be responsible was too painful for them to accept at first. Some even wondered if Bonnie had run away to escape the marriage. Maybe she was somewhere safe, waiting for the right moment to return. On the other side were Michael Haim's relatives, who defended him wholeheartedly. They believed fully in Michael's story, that Bonnie had walked out that night on her own, leaving her purse, her son, and her entire life behind. They insisted that Michael loved Bonnie, that he would never hurt her, and that the toddler's statements were nothing more than the imagination of a frightened child. Investigators were stuck between two conflicting realities. A child's haunting words, a divided family, and a missing young mother with no trace of life. With no body, no physical evidence tying Michael to a crime, and no witnesses to confirm or deny what really happened inside that house, the case began to fade from public attention. Leads dried up. Tips stopped coming in. The trail went cold, completely cold. Months turned into years. Years turned into decades. And for the case of Bonnie Haim, everything froze in place. A missing mother. A son with memories no one could verify. A family split apart. And a mystery with no solution. But time has a way of uncovering truth, often when no one expects it. And in the Bonnie Haim case, the truth would come from the very person who had spoken those chilling words as a child. The years moved forward. The disappearance of Bonnie Haim transformed from an active investigation into a painful, unresolved cold case. With no body, no physical evidence strong enough to prove murder, and no new leads emerging, Bonnie's case slowly slipped into the category detectives dread the most, an unsolved mystery suspended in time. For the Haim and Fraser families, those years were agonizing. Every holiday, every birthday, every quiet moment served as a reminder that Bonnie was gone without explanation. Rumors surfaced, theories formed, and family relationships fractured. Some clung to hope, believing Bonnie might still be alive somewhere. Others carried a growing certainty that something terrible had happened inside the Haim home that night in January 1993. Through it all, there was one person who grew up under the heavy shadow of the past. Aaron, Bonnie and Michael Haim's son. The same child who had said, "Daddy hurt Mommy," when he was just 3 years old. As Aaron grew older, memories sharpened, questions deepened, and suspicion took root. He lived with the truth that his mother had disappeared when he was a toddler, and yet no one had ever been held responsible. No justice, no closure, no answers. By the early 2000s, Aaron, now going by the name Aaron Fraser, began taking steps adults never imagined a child from this case would take. In 2004, more than a decade after Bonnie vanished, Aaron made a bold decision. He filed a wrongful death lawsuit against his father, Michael Haim, accusing him of killing Bonnie. During the civil trial, testimony resurfaced about the tension inside the Haim home, the discovery of Bonnie's purse at the airport dumpster, the position of the driver's seat in her abandoned Camry, and the inconsistencies in Michael's story. This time, without the restrictions of a criminal trial, the civil jury was allowed to weigh evidence differently. The result was stunning. Aaron Fraser won the lawsuit. The jury awarded him approximately $26.3 million in damages. But the most significant outcome wasn't the money. It was the house. As part of the judgment, Aaron was granted ownership of the Haim family home in Jacksonville. The same house where he last saw his mother alive, the same house where investigators always suspected something had happened. At the time, no one knew that awarding Aaron that home would become one of the most explosive turning points in the entire case. But that moment was still years away. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the emotional toll on the family was enormous. Bonnie's parents spent years living in uncertainty, never fully knowing what had happened to their daughter. Friends who remembered Bonnie as a gentle, determined young mother were left with memories instead of answers. And Aaron carried the weight of loss, suspicion, and an entire cold case reality that hung over him like a shadow. For more than 20 years, Bonnie's disappearance remained unsolved. No body, no closure, no truth. Everyone believed the case was frozen forever. But the truth was not lost. It was buried and waiting. And when it finally surfaced, it would be uncovered by the same little boy who first said what happened, the one person who had lived his entire life within the mystery. More than 2 decades had passed since Bonnie Haim vanished in January 1993. Her case had gone cold, stalled, and nearly faded into the long list of unsolved disappearances, until the very person who once said, "Daddy hurt Mommy," now an adult, stepped onto the property where it all began. In December 2014, Aaron Fraser, now grown and the legal owner of the Haim family home, began renovations on the backyard. The place where he had played as a toddler, the place he could barely remember, the place investigators had always wondered about, but never searched deeply enough to find what was hidden. Aaron planned to install a new pool. To do that, workers first needed to demolish an old concrete slab behind the house, a structure that had been there since the early 1990s. As heavy machinery cracked through the concrete, something unexpected surfaced. A torn plastic bag, buried beneath layers of earth. At first, Aaron thought nothing of it. During home renovations, debris in the soil isn't unusual. He kneeled down, brushed away some dirt, and lifted what looked like a round object inside the bag. He later said he initially thought it was a coconut, something harmless, ordinary. But then, as more dirt brushed away, and the shape became clear, he froze. What he was holding wasn't a coconut. It was a human skull, with visible teeth and eye sockets. And it was buried just a few feet from the home where Bonnie Haim was last seen alive. Aaron immediately called authorities. Soon, Forensic teams, investigators, and crime scene units filled the backyard that had once been his childhood playground. It didn't take long for them to determine that these were human remains buried intentionally. Within days, DNA confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Bonnie Haim. After more than 20 years, Bonnie had finally been found, right behind the house she shared with Michael. The medical examiner concluded that her death was a homicide, although the exact manner could not be determined. But there was another crucial discovery at the burial site. Investigators recovered a .22 caliber shell casing in the same area where Bonnie had been hidden. It was a significant find because Michael Haim was known to own a .22 caliber rifle at the time of Bonnie's disappearance. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. The truth had been buried, literally, in the backyard for decades, hidden under concrete, hidden where no one thought to look, hidden behind the home where Bonnie spent her last night alive. The shocking part wasn't just the discovery. It was who discovered it. The same child who once said, "Daddy hurt Mommy." The same child whose words were dismissed because he was too young. The same child who grew up searching for answers. He was the one who found his mother. 2 decades later, the truth finally surfaced. Not because investigators uncovered it. Not because a witness came forward. But because Aaron Fraser dug up the very evidence that solved the case. And with the discovery of Bonnie's remains, the cold case was no longer cold. Justice was coming next. The discovery in December 2014 changed everything. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty, investigators finally had the evidence they needed. With Bonnie Haim's remains confirmed, with a .22 caliber shell casing found near the burial site, and with the location of the grave pointing directly to the home she shared with her husband, detectives could no longer ignore the obvious. In August 2015, authorities made the decision that had been building for years. Michael Haim was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the disappearance and death of Bonnie Haim. For the first time since 1993, there was a clear path toward justice. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors assembled a narrative built on decades of suspicion. Bonnie's secret bank account, the history of arguments inside the home, the purse found in the airport dumpster, the abandoned Toyota Camry with the seat pushed back too far, the toddler's early statements, and now the most powerful evidence of all. Bonnie had been buried in her own backyard. After years of delays, appeals, and legal battles, the case finally went before a jury in April 2019. Inside the courtroom, the story of Bonnie's last night played out in painstaking detail. Witnesses recounted the arguments, the fear Bonnie had confided in friends, and the tension that defined the marriage. Experts testified about the remains, the timeline, and the shell casing. And then came the testimony that hit the courtroom the hardest, Aaron Fraser. He spoke not only as the man who uncovered the truth with his own hands, but as the child who had lost his mother before he was old enough to understand what had happened. The emotion in his voice, the years of unanswered questions, and the pain he carried made it clear that Bonnie's disappearance had destroyed far more than just one life. After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered their verdict in May 2019. Michael Haim was found guilty of second-degree murder. Just days later, on May 21, 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison. During the sentencing hearing, family members delivered powerful victim impact statements that had been bottled up for more than 25 years. One of the most striking came from Bonnie's relatives, who said, "While he remained free, our safety was always in question." For the first time in decades, they no longer had to live with that fear. For the first time in decades, they could say out loud what they had suspected all along. For the first time in decades, justice had a name. Michael Haim appealed the conviction, but in May 2021, the appellate court upheld his life sentence, concluding that the evidence, the timeline, and the discovery of Bonnie's remains all pointed to one undeniable truth. The truth that had been buried beneath a concrete slab for 21 years had finally caught up with him. When the verdict came down and Michael Haim was found guilty of second-degree murder, the courtroom was silent. It wasn't the silence of surprise. Most of the people who had lived through this case already knew in their hearts what had happened. It was the silence of relief, the silence of 26 years' worth of weight finally lifting, even if only slightly. For Aaron Fraser, the emotional impact ran deeper than anyone else in the room. This was the same child who once told investigators, "Daddy hurt Mommy," long before he understood the magnitude of those words. Now he was an adult, testifying in court about the day he found his mother's remains buried under that old concrete slab. He spoke about the moment he picked up what he thought was a piece of debris, only to realize it was a skull. He testified about the shock, the grief, and the decades of trauma that had shaped his life. Years of emotional turmoil surfaced during his testimony. The confusion of growing up without a mother, the questions no one could answer, and the internal conflict of being raised by the very person later accused of killing her. Aaron revealed that the trauma forced him into long-term therapy, where he tried to unravel the pain he had carried since childhood. The memories he had suppressed, the words he had spoken as a toddler, and the truth he ultimately uncovered himself. It all came rushing back in waves. For Bonnie Haim's family, the discovery of her remains brought a bittersweet form of resolution. They finally had answers they had begged for, prayed for, and agonized over for more than 2 decades. But even with the truth exposed, family members made it clear that closure was not a word they could fully embrace. One relative explained it best. They now knew what happened, but nothing could give them back the years they lost with Bonnie. Nothing could undo the pain her disappearance inflicted on the entire family. Nothing could rewrite the childhood Aaron was forced to endure. They expressed relief that the man responsible was finally behind bars, acknowledging that his freedom had cast a shadow over their lives for decades. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant wondering, those feelings slowly eased after the conviction. Still, they made it clear that Bonnie's absence would forever be felt. Looking back, the case of Bonnie Haim demonstrates just how fragile justice can be when evidence is missing and truth is buried, literally and emotionally. It took perseverance, both from detectives and from Bonnie's own son, to reach the point where the case could finally be solved. It took luck, in the form of a home renovation that just happened to break open the exact concrete slab under which she had been hidden. And it took timing because years earlier, the technology, the evidence, and the law simply weren't enough to bring Michael to justice. A cold case that once seemed destined to fade into obscurity was revived by the persistence of a family that never gave up, and by a son who refused to stop searching for the truth. The emotional scars remain, but the truth, long buried, finally came to the surface. The case of Bonnie Haim is more than a true crime story. It's a reminder of the hidden dangers inside homes that appear calm from the outside, the long shadow domestic violence can cast, and the devastating impact these crimes leave behind, especially on children. Bonnie was only 23 years old when she disappeared, a young mother trying to protect her son, trying to build a better future, trying to break free from fear. Her life was taken far too soon, and her story stands as a tragic example of how difficult it can be for victims to escape abusive situations. This case also shows the enormous challenges law enforcement faces when a disappearance occurs without a body. For years, investigators believed something terrible had happened to Bonnie, yet without physical evidence, their hands were tied. Cases like hers demonstrate why so many disappearances remain unsolved, and how the absence of a body can silence justice for decades. But the story of Bonnie Haim also highlights something powerful: persistence. Her family refused to let her memory fade. Detectives kept the case open, even when leads dried up. And Aaron Fraser, the little boy who once said, "Daddy hurt Mommy," never stopped searching for the truth, even when it meant reliving trauma buried deep in his childhood. In the end, the breakthrough came from a moment no one could have predicted. Not a new witness, not a confession, not a forensic update, but a simple home renovation, the demolition of a concrete slab in the backyard of the very house where Bonnie lived. That moment uncovered the truth that had been hidden for more than 20 years. It revealed how far someone went to conceal a crime, and how fate, timing, and persistence combined to finally bring justice. This case teaches us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. It shows that the memories of a child, even fragmented, even doubted, can carry pieces of the truth. And it exposes the fragility of family trust, especially when the people closest to us are capable of secrets darker than anyone imagined. Most importantly, it brings the focus back to Bonnie herself. A mother, a daughter, a young woman who deserved safety, respect, and a full life with her son. Her story matters, not because of how it ended, but because of who she was and how many people fought to make sure she wasn't forgotten. If you found this case compelling, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this case, and of course hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're notified when our next true crime documentary drops on Real Crime Documentary Stories. Thanks for watching.